It was a late evening, and the police department was buzzing with activity. Officers were restless, and everyone's eyes were fixed on the large screen in the darkened room. They were watching CCTV footage on repeat. Just hours ago, a young black boy had been reported missing, and every second that passed made the urgency more intense. It wasn't just any night, it was election night, and the streets were filled with people celebrating and cheering for the newly elected president. Detective Casey, a seasoned officer, was leading the investigation. She watched the screen intently as the footage rewound, pausing at a suspicious point. There it was, a glimpse of the boy's bright yellow jacket. They had found him in the footage, but something was terribly wrong. The boy was last seen entering an official-looking black SUV, the kind that only high-ranking officials or VIPs would drive. "What's the license plate?" one officer asked anxiously, zooming in to get a clearer view. But as they zoomed in, Casey's heart dropped. The plate matched a vehicle that belonged to none other than the newly elected president. A murmur of disbelief filled the room. How could this be possible? Could the new president really be connected to the boy's disappearance? Casey didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was there, right in front of her. The boy had entered the president's car, and he hadn't been seen since. Without wasting another second, Casey ordered the arrest of the president. It was the most shocking command she'd ever given, but she knew they had to act fast. As the officers hurried to carry out her orders, her mind raced with questions. How could this happen? Why would the president be involved with a missing child? What secrets were about to be uncovered? Just as the team geared up to take action, another officer burst into the room, his face pale. "We had more footage," he stammered, unable to finish his sentence, as he held up a USB drive that contained another recording from a different camera angle. Everyone in the room went silent as they plugged it in, bracing for whatever was about to be revealed. Earlier that day, the sun was just starting to rise over the city as 10-year-old Marcus happily skipped his way to school. He had no idea that today would be unlike any other. He wore his favorite bright yellow jacket, the one his mom had bought him as a birthday gift. On his way, he noticed people setting up signs and banners for the Election Day rally. Marcus loved to learn about leaders and presidents, so he was excited to see all the decorations and watch as people chattered about who would win. But as he approached his school, something unusual caught his eye. A black SUV was parked across the street, and inside was a man in a suit who seemed to be watching him. It was unusual for such a fancy car to be parked near his school, and Marcus felt a slight shiver, but he brushed it off. After all, he'd been taught to always mind his business and keep moving. He tightened his backpack straps and went into school. As the day went on, Marcus's teachers noticed he was distracted, glancing out the window more than usual. Little did he know, the same black SUV was parked there, waiting. Just after school ended, Marcus decided to take his time walking home, as he often did. But as he made his way down the usual route, he noticed that black SUV slowly trailing behind him. This time, though, the window rolled down, and a man inside waved at him, asking for directions to a nearby landmark. Not wanting to be rude, Marcus cautiously approached the car, stopping a safe distance away. The man inside smiled, thanking him for his help, and asked if he wanted a ride home. Marcus shook his head, but the man was persistent, trying to coax him closer with promises of candy and toys. At that moment, another extreme event unfolded. Marcus's phone rang, breaking the eerie silence between him and the man in the car. It was his mother, asking if he was on his way home. This quick conversation made Marcus feel a bit safer. He told his mom he was walking and would be home soon. He moved away from the SUV, but the man's gaze followed him, chilling into his core. Marcus hurried his steps, not looking back until he was safely out of sight. That evening, Marcus's mom grew worried. He should have been home by now, but there was no sign of him. She dialed his number, but there was no answer. Each time the call went to voicemail, her heart sank a little more. By nightfall, she couldn't wait any longer. She called the police, her voice trembling as she reported her son missing. The police were quick to respond, especially because of Marcus's age. The streets were alive with people celebrating the new president, but for Marcus's mother, the noise only heightened her sense of dread. She handed the officers a recent photo of Marcus, describing the bright yellow jacket he wore. As the search began, Detective Casey and her team combed through CCTV footage from every corner of the city. Hours passed with no sign of him, until finally, they caught a break. The footage showed Marcus near the black SUV. As the police delved deeper into the footage, they noticed the SUV lingered near Marcus's school, trailing him just before he went missing. That was when Detective Casey spotted the license plate, the shocking moment that led to the president's arrest. Back to the night of the arrest. Inside the police station, Detective Casey watched the new footage with mounting horror. The second camera angle revealed more details about the SUV's movements after Marcus got in. She saw the vehicle head down a side street before pulling into the garage of a building known for hosting political events. "It doesn't make any sense," Casey muttered to herself, pacing the room. Why would the president's car be involved in something like this? Before she could process it, the phone rang. The officer on the line reported the president's vehicle was last tracked to a private residence near the hills. "We've sent units to investigate." Casey barely had time to absorb this when another call came in, an emergency request to halt the arrest. The request came from the highest levels of government. Casey clenched her jaw, knowing she couldn't ignore it. But her resolve was unshakable. "I don't care if he's the president or the king. If he's involved in this, we're bringing him in." Her team backed her up, and the orders stood. Officers prepared to make their way to the president's private residence, where they hoped to find more clues, and maybe even Marcus. Earlier that afternoon, Marcus's journey with the man in the black SUV began as he reluctantly climbed inside, pressured by the stranger's seemingly kind offer. The man assured him it was safe, even showing him a badge with a seal Marcus vaguely recognized from his history books. The stranger chatted casually with Marcus, asking questions about his school, his favorite games, and what he wanted to be when he grew up. Marcus answered politely but nervously. He knew his mom wouldn't approve of him riding with a stranger, but he didn't know how to refuse a man who seemed so important. After a few minutes of polite talk, Marcus noticed the car had turned onto an unfamiliar road, far from his usual route home. He felt a twist in his stomach. "I thought you were taking me home," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The man flashed a smile, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "Don't worry, kid. I just need to make a quick stop first." As the car drove on, Marcus's unease grew. He glanced out the window, hoping to recognize a landmark, a building, anything that could help him find his way back. But as the car entered a remote gated area surrounded by tall trees, his heart began to race. He realized he was alone, far from anyone who could help him. He gripped his backpack, his fingers trembling, as the man kept driving. The SUV pulled up to a large, intimidating house nestled in the woods. The man got out, opened Marcus's door, and gestured for him to follow. "Come on, kid. It's just a little meeting. Then I'll beat you home." Feeling trapped, Marcus followed him inside. He was led down a long hallway into a room with dark curtains and dim lighting, where a few people were gathered, speaking in low voices. Meanwhile, Casey and her team arrived at the president's private residence, where they were met with a tense standoff. Agents at the scene tried to block their entry, but after Casey showed her warrant, they relented. They searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of Marcus. The president himself was nowhere to be found either, which only made things worse. The officers moved through each room, their flashlights illuminating dusty shelves and heavy curtains, but every room was empty. Just when Casey started to think the lead was a dead end, an officer called her over. "Detective, you'll want to see this." He led her down to the basement, where they found a hidden door. The door led to an underground tunnel that seemed to stretch on forever, its walls lined with old torn posters from political campaigns long past. The eerie tunnel made Casey shiver, but they pressed forward, following the path in hopes of finding answers. As they walked through the darkness, the silence was broken by a faint, echoing voice. They couldn't make out the words, but they could tell it was a young voice, calling out. The voice was faint, but unmistakably a child's. Casey's heart skipped a beat. She motioned for the officers to stay silent as they moved closer, their footsteps light on the damp, cold floor of the tunnel. "Help? Is anyone there?" The voice was trembling, laced with fear, but Casey knew instantly it was Marcus. She broke into a run, the officers close behind her, until they reached a small metal door at the end of the tunnel. She could hear Marcus on the other side, his muffled cries sending a chill down her spine. Casey jiggled the door handle, but it was locked. Without hesitation, one of the officers slammed into it with his shoulder, and with a loud creak, the door gave way. Inside, they found Marcus sitting on the floor, his bright yellow jacket dirty and crumpled. His face lit up when he saw them, and relief flooded his eyes. Casey crouched down beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, you're safe now. We're here." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes wide. "Thank you, officer. I didn't know if anyone would find me." She helped him to his feet, and they began to walk back through the tunnel. But as they emerged from the basement, Marcus turned to Casey, clutching her arm. "The man who brought me here. He said he was someone important." Casey exchanged glances with the other officers, her mind racing. "Marcus, can you tell us what he looked like?" Marcus swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. He was tall, with dark sunglasses, and he wore a suit. He kept talking about how powerful he was. Casey's heart pounded. The description matched the president, and with each word Marcus spoke, the evidence mounted. She could barely believe it, but every piece of the puzzle pointed to the same shocking conclusion. As they guided Marcus outside, the officers set up a perimeter around the area. Word had already spread to the media, and reporters were gathering near the scene, their cameras flashing as they strained to catch a glimpse of the young boy. But just as Casey was about to bring Marcus to safety, a black SUV pulled up near the perimeter. To everyone's astonishment, the newly elected president stepped out, flanked by 2 bodyguards. His expression was unreadable, and as he made his way toward Casey, a thick silence fell over the crowd. Reporters held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Casey stood her ground, her grip tightening on Marcus's shoulder as she met the president's gaze. She wasn't about to back down, not after everything she'd uncovered. The president stopped just a few feet away, his face a mix of defiance and confidence. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I came to clarify that I had nothing to do with this." Casey's eyes narrowed. "If that's true, then why did your vehicle match the one that took Marcus? And why does he describe a man that looks exactly like you?" The president's face hardened. "Are you really going to believe the word of a scared child over a man who just won the trust of an entire nation?" His voice was dripping with disdain, and his bodyguards took a step forward, trying to shield him from the growing crowd. Casey took a deep breath, her voice unwavering. "We have enough evidence to hold you for questioning, sir. If you're truly innocent, you'll come with us and help us clear this up." The president hesitated, glancing around at the officers, then at the gathering crowd. For the first time, Casey saw a flicker of something she hadn't expected, fear. But before she could say another word, Marcus stepped forward, his small voice breaking through the tension. "That's him. He's the man who put me in that room," Marcus said, his voice trembling but firm. Gasps echoed through the crowd, and the reporters began furiously snapping pictures, shouting questions at the president. The officers stepped forward, ready to place him under arrest, when one of his bodyguards suddenly pushed Casey back, grabbing Marcus by the arm in a swift motion. "Let him go," Casey yelled, rushing forward, but the bodyguard was quick, hauling Marcus toward the SUV. The president climbed into the vehicle, and the crowd erupted in chaos. Casey and her team chased after the SUV as it sped off, Marcus's terrified face pressed against the window. The car raced down the street, the sound of sirens blaring as patrol cars joined the pursuit. Just when Casey thought the chase couldn't get more intense, the SUV took a sharp turn down a side street, aiming to lose them. Casey's car followed close behind, her heart pounding as she fought to keep up. The chase twisted and turned through the city streets, the president's SUV narrowly avoiding obstacles in its path. Then, just as the SUV sped onto an empty road, Casey saw a police blockade up ahead. She felt a surge of hope. There was no way out now. But the president's SUV showed no signs of slowing down. It was heading straight for the blockade, faster and faster, leaving Casey breathless as she watched. The SUV hurtled toward the police blockade, and the officers standing guard braced themselves. Just when it seemed like the vehicle would crash through, it screeched to a halt, tires smoking. Doors flew open, and the president's bodyguards quickly stepped out, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Inside the car, however, the president remained seated, his face a mask of cold defiance. But Marcus, still trapped in the back seat, pounded on the window, his wide eyes filled with terror. Casey rushed forward, her team following close behind. With a nod, she signaled to the officers to pull open the SUV doors and retrieve Marcus. One officer carefully helped Marcus out, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders as he trembled. Casey knelt down beside him, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, you're safe now." "We'd got you," she whispered, relief flooding her voice. The boy nodded, but his eyes drifted back to the president, who was being escorted out of the SUV, his hands now cuffed. As the officers moved him toward the police car, the president glared at Casey. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice laced with anger. "This is a mistake." Casey held her ground, meeting his gaze steadily. "If it's a mistake, then you'll have a chance to clear your name. But right now, we have evidence, and we have a witness." The president's scowl deepened, but he said nothing as the officers led him away. Reporters swarmed, microphones and cameras thrust toward him, but he remained silent, his jaw clenched tightly. The entire city was watching. The news of the president's involvement in the disappearance of a young boy spread like wildfire, and within minutes, every major news channel was covering the story. Crowds gathered outside the police station, chanting for justice as Casey's team brought the president in for questioning. After making sure Marcus was safely reunited with his mother, Casey returned to the interrogation room, where the president sat, his hands still cuffed to the table. He looked up as she entered, his eyes flashing with anger and defiance. Casey took a seat across from him, setting a folder of evidence on the table between them. "We have surveillance footage, Marcus's testimony, and now we have your vehicle linked to his disappearance. You'd better start explaining." The president leaned back, his expression unchanging. "I don't have to explain anything to you," he said coolly. "This is all a smear campaign. People are always looking for ways to bring down those in power." Casey raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying a 10-year-old boy, whom you took from his school, is lying? You're saying the footage showing him getting into your car was fabricated?" The president smirked. "You'd be surprised what people can make up when they're desperate." Casey felt a surge of frustration. She'd dealt with many difficult suspects, but none as brazen as this. "Look, we both know the truth is going to come out. The more you try to deny it, the worse it's going to look." Silence fell over the room as they stared each other down. Finally, the president leaned forward, his voice low and mocking. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But you have no idea who you're dealing with." Casey kept her composure, but his words sent a chill down her spine. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," he replied, his tone icy. "I may be in here now, but trust me, powerful people don't stay down for long, and when I'm out, you'll regret this." Meanwhile, Marcus sat with his mother in a quiet room at the police station, sipping a hot chocolate and telling the officers everything he remembered. He recounted the strange man's words, the ride in the SUV, and the eerie house in the woods. "Did he hurt you?" one of the officers asked gently. Marcus shook his head. "No. He kept saying he just wanted to talk. He kept asking me about my family, about my school. But I didn't like the way he looked at me. It was scary." Marcus's mother hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You're so brave, Marcus. I'm so proud of you." As Marcus recounted his story, Casey returned from the interrogation room, her expression grim. She knelt down beside him, a gentle smile on her face. "Marcus, thank you for being so strong. We're going to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." Marcus nodded, clutching his mother's hand. "I just want to go home." Casey promised him he would be home soon, and as she watched Marcus and his mother leave, she felt a renewed determination. She knew that this was only the beginning. The president's arrest had shaken the entire city, and there would be consequences. As the night wore on, the president remained in custody, but the station was buzzing with tension. Officers whispered among themselves, wondering what kind of backlash they might face for arresting someone so powerful. Just then, a call came through. The officer answering it paled as he listened, then rushed over to Casey. "Detective, we have a situation. There's been a break-in at the courthouse. Someone tried to tamper with the evidence we collected." Casey's stomach dropped. "What? When?" "Just now. It didn't get far. But it's clear someone's trying to cover things up." Casey's mind raced. The president's warning echoed in her head. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. If the president had allies powerful enough to try and erase evidence, then Marcus's life, her life, and the lives of everyone involved in this case were in serious danger. But she couldn't back down now. The truth was too important. As she turned to face the officers gathered around her, her voice was steady. "We're going to protect this evidence, and we're going to keep Marcus safe, no matter what it takes." The officers nodded in agreement, their faces resolute. But as Casey walked back to her office, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Just as Casey settled into her office to regroup, another officer knocked urgently on her door. "Detective Williams, you need to see this," he said, his face tense. She followed him down the hallway, her nerves on edge, wondering what new obstacle awaited. He led her to the main operations room, where a large monitor displayed live security footage from around the police station. The officer gestured to one of the screens, pointing out two black SUVs parked outside. Several men in suits, their faces obscured by the dim lighting, stood beside the vehicles, their expressions unreadable. "Who are they?" Casey asked, though a part of her already suspected the answer. "We're not sure," the officer replied, but they arrived just a few minutes ago and haven't made a move. They're just waiting. Casey's mind raced. The men had the look of government agents, but there was something more ominous in their presence. It was almost as if they were there to intimidate the station, a silent reminder of the power the president still held, even in custody. "Double the security," Casey ordered. "I want everyone on alert." As the officer relayed her instructions, Casey glanced at her watch. It was past midnight, and Marcus was resting in a safe room down the hall, guarded by 2 officers. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Just then, her phone buzzed. She looked down to see a text message from an unknown number. "You have 1 chance to release him, detective. Fail to comply, and everyone in that building will pay the price." A chill ran through her. She held up the phone for the officer beside her to see. His face went pale, and he immediately called for more backup. "Detective," he whispered, "do you think they would actually?" Casey took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't know. But we're not backing down. Let's tighten security and keep Marcus under watch. We'll play this one by the book, no matter what threats they throw our way." An hour later, in the dimly lit hallway outside the holding cells, Casey checked in on the president, who sat in his cell, arms folded, looking unfazed. The look he gave her was one of cool amusement, almost as if he knew something she didn't. "You're making a big mistake, detective," he sneered. "There's only so much you can do to keep this under wraps. Sooner or later, they'll come for me, and when they do, they won't lead witnesses." Casey remained silent, refusing to let him get under her skin. She knew that his allies were powerful, but she also knew that justice had to be served. She turned to leave, but he continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You can walk away from this, detective. If you know what's good for you, you'll release me and pretend this never happened." She stopped in her tracks and looked back at him, her voice firm. "You hurt a child and put him through a nightmare. There's no way I'm letting you walk free." The president shrugged, seemingly unbothered. "Have your way. I promise you'll regret this." Back in the operations room, Casey rejoined her team, who had gathered around a table, studying the security footage of the SUVs outside. The men were still waiting, occasionally glancing toward the entrance of the station. The tension in the room was thick. One officer murmured, "It feels like they're just waiting for the right moment to act." Another officer added, "If they're as powerful as they seem, we may need to call in the National Guard. We're not equipped for a standoff like this." Casey shook her head. "That's exactly what they want. The minute we escalate this, they'll claim we're the ones overreacting. We need to stay calm and handle this quietly." Just then, a voice crackled over the radio. "Detective Williams, we have a problem." The back entrance alarm just went off. Casey's heart sank. She pulled out her radio, barking orders to the nearby officers. "Lock down all exits. Nobody in or out until we know what's going on." Her instincts told her that this was part of a coordinated attack, a silent operation to retrieve the president without creating a public spectacle. They were trying to keep this as quiet as possible. Casey motioned for her team to follow as she rushed down the hallway toward the back entrance. The dimly lit corridor stretched ahead, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. She motioned for her team to keep their weapons ready. Suddenly, 2 men in dark suits rounded the corner, their eyes cold and focused. They spotted Casey and her team, raising their hands as if to show they were unarmed. "We don't want any trouble," one of the men said smoothly. "We're just here for him. Hand him over, and nobody gets hurt." Casey clenched her fists, refusing to be intimidated. "You have no authority here. This is a police matter, and he's staying right where he is." The men exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. But before Casey could react, one of them swiftly reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device. He pressed a button, and suddenly the entire building was plunged into darkness. Casey's team flicked on their flashlights, the narrow beams cutting through the shadows. She could hear the sounds of footsteps scrambling in every direction, and the crackle of panicked voices over the radio. Whoever these men were, they had come prepared. "Stay together," Casey whispered urgently to her team, motioning for them to spread out and cover the hallway. As they advanced cautiously, Casey's thoughts raced. She needed to get back to Marcus. If these men were after the president, there was no telling what they might do to cover their tracks. Marcus huddled in the corner of the safe room, clutching the blanket around him as the lights went out. He could hear footsteps outside the door, and his heart pounded with fear. He wanted to believe Casey's promise that he was safe. In the darkness, he felt vulnerable and alone. The door opened, and a shadowy figure stepped inside. Marcus squinted, trying to make out the face of the person who entered. But before he could react, strong arms wrapped around him, lifting him off the ground. Marcus let out a terrified scream, his voice echoing through the room. Casey heard the scream, and her blood ran cold. She sprinted toward the safe room, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she ran. Her team followed close behind, their footsteps echoing in the dark. When she reached the room, she found the door open, and Marcus was gone. Her heart sank, a sickening dread filling her stomach. One of the officers looked at her, his face pale. "Detective, he's been taken." Casey's mind raced, her stomach twisting with fear. Marcus was gone, and in the pitch darkness of the building, she had no idea where the kidnappers had taken him. Whoever these men were, they were well prepared, and she could feel the stakes rising by the second. Her radio crackled, and a familiar voice broke through. "Detective Williams, we've got movement in the basement." Someone disabled the cameras, but there was a brief flicker of two figures heading down there. Casey gripped her radio, trying to keep her voice steady. "Copy that. Send backup to the basement immediately. We're going down." She led her team through the darkened hallways, the tension mounting with every step. The basement was one of the most isolated areas of the station, normally used for storage and old case files. If the kidnappers were trying to slip out with Marcus, they'd likely found a way to bypass the main exits. Marcus struggled against the man holding him, but his grip was unyielding. They moved quickly through the dimly lit corridor, heading toward a small service door that led to the outside. The man's expression was cold and determined, barely acknowledging Marcus's pleas to be let go. "Stop struggling," the man growled, tightening his grip. "You're only making this harder for yourself." Marcus felt tears welling up, his body trembling. He wanted to scream again, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. All he could do was try to remember Casey's words, "Stay calm, and someone will come for you." But as they neared the exit, his hope began to waver. He could hear muffled sounds in the distance, shouts, footsteps, maybe even gunfire. But he was getting further away from help with each passing second. Casey and her team reached the basement stairwell, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. She led the way, moving cautiously but urgently. The dim light cast eerie shadows on the walls, and she felt a mounting pressure as they descended. When they reached the basement floor, one of the officers pointed to a faint scuff mark on the floor, a sign that someone had passed through. Casey's instincts told her that they were close. Her radio crackled to life again. "Williams, we've got multiple unauthorized vehicles pulling up outside. They're surrounding the building." Casey's heart pounded. She knew they were running out of time. "Hold your positions outside. Don't let anyone in or out." She turned to her team. "We're going to find Marcus. Let's move." The faint sounds of footsteps and murmurs guided her deeper into the basement. Finally, she caught sight of two figures at the far end of the corridor, silhouetted against the emergency exit light. One of them was dragging Marcus, his small form struggling against the grip. "Freeze," Casey shouted, aiming her flashlight at them. The man holding Marcus whipped around, momentarily blinded by the light. But instead of releasing Marcus, he pulled him close, using him as a human shield. "Don't come any closer," he barked, his voice sharp and dangerous. "One more step, and the boy gets hurt." Casey held up her hands, trying to keep him calm. "Let him go. There's no need for this." The man's eyes were cold. "You don't understand. He knows too much, and I have orders." "Orders?" Casey asked, her mind racing. "Orders from who?" The man didn't answer, but his grip on Marcus tightened, and she could see the fear in the boy's eyes. She needed to find a way to defuse the situation before it spiraled out of control. "You don't have to do this," Casey said, her voice steady. "We can figure this out. Just let him go, and we'll talk." But before she could say another word, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway behind her. Another group of men in dark suits appeared, blocking any possible escape. It was clear they were here to make sure the president got what he wanted. One of the newcomers spoke up, his tone authoritative. "You're outnumbered, detective. Step aside and let us do our job, or this situation will only get worse." Casey clenched her jaw, refusing to back down. "This boy is innocent, and I'm not letting you take him. If you want him, you'll have to go through me." The man smirked, clearly unimpressed. "We'll see about that." In one swift motion, he raised his hand, signaling his men to move in. Casey's team tensed, ready for a standoff. But in that moment of distraction, Marcus acted on instinct. With a burst of energy, he stomped on his captor's foot and twisted out of his grasp, ducking under his arm and scrambling toward Casey. "Run, Marcus," she shouted as the men lunged forward to recapture him. Her team opened fire, creating a wall of protection as Marcus started toward her. The basement erupted into chaos, the sounds of gunfire echoing off the walls as Casey pulled Marcus behind her, shielding him. "Go! Head back to the stairs," she shouted to her team, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. They moved swiftly, firing strategically to cover each other as they fought their way back to the stairwell. Marcus clung to Casey, his small hands gripping her jacket as she guided him through the narrow hallway. Just as they reached the stairs, a gunshot rang out, striking the wall inches from Casey's head. She ducked, pulling Marcus close as her team returned fire, driving back the advancing men. They made it to the stairwell, but the attackers were relentless, following close behind. Casey knew they couldn't hold them off forever. "We need backup down here," she shouted into her radio, desperation creeping into her voice. "Repeat, we need backup in the basement immediately." Meanwhile, the crowd of reporters and onlookers outside the station had grown larger, and the sounds of gunfire from within had begun to spread panic. Officers were doing their best to control the situation, but it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Inside, Casey's backup finally arrived, and officers began flooding into the basement to support her team. They'd form a defensive line, pushing back the attackers and securing an escape route. With Marcus still clinging to her, Casey led him up the stairs, her team covering their retreat. When they finally emerged into the main hall of the station, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But the relief was short-lived. As they rushed toward a safe room, one of her officers caught her arm, his face pale. "Detective, we've got a new problem. The president's allies have leaked false evidence to the media. They're claiming we kidnapped him and that he's being held illegally." Casey's blood ran cold. "What? How could they?" The officer shook his head. "It's all over the news, Detective. They're saying you've gone rogue, and that this whole thing is a setup." Casey felt a sinking dread. She knew that powerful people could manipulate the media, but to twist the entire narrative in a matter of hours, it was beyond anything she'd anticipated. As she looked down at Marcus, his face pale and frightened, she realized that the fight was far from over. Now, not only were they battling for Marcus's life, but they were also up against a web of lies that threatened to turn the public against them. But she wasn't about to give up. She knew the truth, and she knew that somewhere within the evidence they'd gathered, there had to be a way to expose the president's crimes and protect Marcus once and for all. She squared her shoulders, her voice steady. "They may have the media, but we have the truth, and we're not stopping until it's out there." As Casey led Marcus to the safe room, her mind raced through possible next steps. She knew she had to act fast. With the media already turning against them, and the president's allies seemingly prepared to do anything to shield him, she needed a plan to secure both Marcus and the evidence before things got even worse. Once inside the safe room, she bent down to look Marcus in the eyes. "Listen, Marcus, I need you to be brave, okay? We're almost there, but I need you to stay quiet and stay close to me. Can you do that?" Marcus nodded, his face still pale but his eyes full of determination. "Yes, Detective Casey." She managed a small smile for him. "Good boy." Just then, her radio crackled. "Detective Williams, it's Chief Harlan. I need you to come to my office now." Casey felt a pang of uncertainty. Chief Harlan was one of the few people she trusted, but with the situation escalating so fast, she couldn't help but feel suspicious of everyone. She took a deep breath and motioned for one of her officers to stay with Marcus. "Don't let anyone in, and don't leave his side," she instructed firmly. The officer nodded, giving her a reassuring look. "I'll guard him with my life." Casey squeezed Marcus's hand one last time before heading to the chief's office, her heart pounding with both dread and resolve. Chief Harlan's office was dimly lit, and he was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the chaos unfolding outside. He turned as Casey entered, his expression grave. "Williams," he began, his tone heavy. "I know you're doing everything you can, but the higher-ups are breathing down my neck. They're demanding I hand the boy over to federal agents by morning." Casey's eyes widened. "Hand him over." "Chief, you know what they'll do. They'll make him disappear, cover up everything he knows. This boy is the only witness we have." Chief Harlan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know, Casey. Believe me, I know. But they're framing this as a kidnapping gone wrong. They've got enough pull to make it look like we're the ones at fault. The press has already spun the story. Public sentiment is shifting fast." Casey clenched her fists. "Chief, this is exactly what they want. We have evidence on that CCTV footage, clear proof that Marcus was taken against his will. We can't let them twist this around." Chief Harlan leaned in, lowering his voice. "Look, we have one chance, Casey, but it's risky." He pulled out a small USB drive from his pocket and held it up. "This has the original CCTV footage. If we leak this to the media, we can show the truth. But once we do, we'll be going against some very powerful people. There's no guarantee this ends well for any of us." Casey met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I'm not letting them take Marcus. We own the truth and justice. If you're with me, Chief, then let's do this." Chief Harlan gave her a steady nod. "All right, but we need to be careful. I've arranged a secure line with a few reporters we can trust. Get this drive to them, and they'll know what to do." Casey felt the weight of the drive in her pocket as she returned to Marcus. She knew this was their only shot to expose the truth, but it was also their riskiest move yet. If anyone intercepted the footage, it would be buried for good, and so might they. She took a deep breath and knelt down in front of Marcus again. "Marcus, we're going to get you somewhere safe, but I need you to stay quiet and stay strong. This might get scary, but I won't let anything happen to you." Marcus nodded, gripping her hand tightly. "I trust you, Detective Casey." With one last look at the team, she led Marcus out of the station through a back exit, keeping to the shadows as they moved. Chief Harlan's plan was for them to meet with a journalist at a safe location downtown, far enough away that they wouldn't be easily followed. As they made their way to the car, Casey couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every car that passed felt like it was moving too slowly. She glanced down at Marcus, who clutched her hand, his eyes wide but focused. "Almost there, kiddo," she whispered, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. The car ride was tense, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears. Casey checked her rearview mirror repeatedly, her senses on high alert. But so far, they seemed to be alone. Halfway through the drive, Marcus finally broke the silence. "Detective Casey, why do they want me to disappear?" Casey's heart ached at the question, but she kept her tone steady. "Because you saw something they don't want people to know about. And when people like that have power, they'll do anything to protect it. But you're brave, Marcus, and telling the truth is the bravest thing you can do." Marcus looked down, his face thoughtful. "I just want to go home. I want my mom." Casey felt a pang of sadness, realizing how much he'd lost in such a short time. "We're going to get you home, Marcus, and we're going to make sure that everyone knows the truth." They'd finally arrived at the safe location, a discreet coffee shop that was closed to the night, but owned by a friend of Chief Harlan's. A lone figure sat in one of the booths, a middle-aged man with glasses and a notebook in hand. Casey recognized him as Jack Reynolds, an investigative reporter known for exposing corruption. She felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could help them get the truth out, it was him. She led Marcus inside and shook Jack's hand. "Thank you for meeting us on such short notice." Jack nodded, glancing at Marcus with a gentle smile. "Anything for the truth, Detective. I've read about your case, and I want to help." Casey handed him the USB drive. "This footage has everything. It shows what really happened, and it proves that Marcus is an innocent witness. We need you to get this out there before they silence us all." Jack nodded, pocketing the drive. "You can count on me, but be careful. If they catch wind of this, they won't hesitate to come after you." Casey gave him a determined look. "We'll manage. Just promise me you'll get this to the public." Jack nodded again, his expression serious. "I will. By morning, the world will know the truth." As they left the coffee shop, Casey felt a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to believe that justice might actually prevail. But as they drove back toward the station, headlights suddenly appeared in her rearview mirror, close and too bright, as if someone was deliberately tailing them. Casey's stomach clenched. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. "Hold on tight, Marcus," she murmured, pressing down on the gas pedal as the car behind them sped up to match her pace. The vehicle swerved closer, trying to force them off the road. Casey gripped the wheel, focusing intently as she maneuvered through the narrow streets, her heart pounding. Just as she thought they might have shaken off their pursuers, a second car appeared from a side street, blocking their path. They were trapped. "Get down, Marcus," she shouted as the first car slammed into their rear bumper, forcing them to a screeching halt. The doors of both cars swung open, and men in dark suits stepped out, weapons in hand. Casey's mind raced. There was no way out, no way to protect Marcus. The men advanced toward the car, their expressions cold and unfeeling. Casey's mind raced, searching for any possible escape, but she knew the odds were stacked against them. She quickly reached across the seat, shielding Marcus as best as she could. One of the men knocked on her window with the butt of his gun, signaling her to get out. "Come on, detective. No need to make this harder than it has to be," he said with a sneer. Casey clenched her jaw but kept her composure. She knew that if she didn't comply, they might hurt Marcus right then and there. Slowly, she raised her hands and stepped out of the car, her eyes darting to the men, taking mental notes of each one. 3 in total, 1 holding the gun, 1 standing guard by the other car, and a 3rd watching Marcus inside. "What do you want?" she demanded, keeping her voice steady. The man with the gun chuckled. "We want the boy. That's all. You hand him over, and we let you walk away. Simple." Casey's gaze flickered back to Marcus, who was trembling in his seat, his small face pale and frightened. There was no way she was giving him up to these men. "You're wasting your time. The footage is already out," she lied. "Everyone will know what you did to that boy." The man's smirk wavered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Nice try, detective. But we have people on the inside. We know you met with Reynolds, and we know he hasn't released anything yet. Now be smart. Give us the boy, and we'll make sure your accident is painless." Casey's heart pounded, her mind racing. She knew she had to act fast. If she could distract them, maybe she and Marcus could make a run for it. She took a deep breath, sizing up her options. Then suddenly, from somewhere behind them, a pair of sirens blared, their lights flashing down the narrow street. The men turned, momentarily thrown off, and Casey seized the opportunity. "Marcus, run!" she shouted, lunging toward the man with the gun, knocking him off balance. Marcus scrambled out of the car and sprinted down the alley, his small figure darting between the shadows. Casey struggled with the man, but he shoved her off, his expression turning furious as he aimed the gun at her. "Wrong move, detective," he snarled. But just as he pulled the trigger, another car screeched to a halt nearby, and Chief Harlan jumped out, his weapon drawn. "Drop it," he yelled, aiming straight at the man. The men hesitated, glancing at each other, realizing they were outnumbered. The one holding Casey hesitated before lowering his gun, a look of pure rage on his face. "You made a powerful enemy tonight, detective," he spat. "This isn't over." With the final glare, the men backed away, retreating to their cars before speeding off into the night. Chief Harlan led Casey and Marcus back to the police station, where a crowd of officers and concerned citizens had gathered. Word of Marcus's kidnapping and the involvement of the president had spread like wildfire. The media was buzzing, and people were demanding answers. As they stepped inside, a familiar face appeared, a reporter from the local news station, microphone in hand. "Detective Williams, is it true that the president himself is implicated in this case? How far does this conspiracy go?" Casey held up a hand, trying to keep the situation under control. "We're still investigating, but I can assure you that we're doing everything possible to bring those responsible to justice." Marcus clung to her side, his small body tense but comforted by the protection of Casey and the officers around them. Later that night, once the commotion died down, Chief Harlan called Casey into his office. She sat down, feeling the exhaustion of the night weighing heavily on her. Harlan gave her a look of admiration mixed with concern. "You did a brave thing, Williams, but you're in deep now. These people, they're not going to stop." Casey nodded. "I know, Chief, but we're too far in to turn back now. Marcus deserves justice, his family deserves justice, and the public deserves to know the truth." Harlan leaned back, considering her words. "Then we have to move fast. I just received word from Reynolds. He's preparing to release the footage, but he's also received threats. They're trying to silence anyone who knows the truth." Casey's heart skipped a beat. "Are they going to pull the story?" "Not yet," Harlan replied, "but we have to be ready for anything. We're going to have 24-hour surveillance on Marcus and his family, and I'm assigning a security detail to you as well." Casey took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the responsibility. "Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down." Harlan nodded, his face grim. "Be careful, Casey. They've already shown they'll stop at nothing to cover this up. We're dealing with people who have power, real power." Casey nodded, determined. "I understand, sir, but I'm not backing down." Later that evening, Casey checked in on Marcus, who was resting in a secure room at the station. He looked up as she entered, giving her a tired smile. "Detective Casey, is it over?" Casey sat down beside him, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Not yet, but we're close. You're safe here, Marcus. We'll keep you protected." Just then, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Jack Reynolds. They'd locked down my office. "Trying to shut down the story. Need backup ASAP." Casey's blood ran cold. She knew what this meant. The powers that be were doing everything they could to prevent the truth from coming out. And then another message appeared, this one from an unknown number. If you don't hand over the boy, there will be consequences. This is your last warning. Casey's hands shook slightly as she looked at Marcus, the gravity of the situation settling on her shoulders. She had to act quickly, but the risks were higher than ever. The threats were real, and now, with the media involved, they'd only intensified. She took a deep breath and dialed Chief Harlan. Chief, they're closing in. They just shut down Reynolds' office and are threatening anyone involved. We're running out of time. What's our next move? Harlan's voice was tense on the other end. Bring Marcus to a safer location. We'll rally support and make sure this story goes live no matter what. Casey hung up, steeling herself. She knew this was about more than just Marcus. It was about truth and justice, and about standing up to those who thought they were untouchable. But as she gathered her things to prepare for their next move, a loud noise echoed through the station, a blast that shook the walls and set off the alarms. Casey spun around, her heart racing, as chaos erupted around her. The station was under attack. Smoke filled the air as the station's alarms blared, red lights flashing across every hallway. Officers scrambled, shouting orders and trying to regain control. Casey shielded Marcus with her body, pulling him away from the door and into a safer corner of the room. Stay low, Marcus, she urged, her voice barely audible over the chaos. She scanned the room, looking for any way out. Whoever was behind this attack had come prepared. They were trying to eliminate anyone with knowledge of the kidnapping. Chief Harlan's voice came over the intercom, struggling to keep calm. All personnel, secure the exits. Evacuate civilians immediately. But Casey knew they couldn't just run out. Marcus was too valuable to their enemies, and she had to keep him hidden until they could regroup. She grabbed her phone, sending a quick message to Chief Harlan. Need backup in holding room. Hostiles may be inside. Marcus's small hand clutched hers, his wide eyes filled with fear. Are they to take me? He whispered, trembling. No, Casey said firmly. I won't let them. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall outside their room. Casey's heart pounded as she listened, trying to gauge how close the attackers were. She tightened her grip on her firearm, ready to defend Marcus at any cost. Then the door burst open. Two masked men stepped inside, guns raised, their eyes scanning the room. Casey acted fast, pulling Marcus down behind a desk and firing a warning shot in their direction. One of the men ducked, but the other charged forward, determined. With no time to think, Casey fired again, grazing the second man's arm. He cried out in pain but managed to stay on his feet, fury flashing in his eyes. Give us the boy, he snarled. Over my dead body, Casey shot back, her voice ice cold. Just then, more officers arrived, weapons drawn. Chief Harlan himself led the charge, his face set in grim determination. He shouted, "Drop your weapons and surrender." The attackers hesitated, clearly realizing they were outnumbered. One of them glanced at the other, and in an instant, they decided to retreat, racing down the hall. The officers chased after them, but Casey knew this was only a temporary victory. Whoever was behind the attack wouldn't stop until they had silenced Marcus, and everyone protecting him. Once the immediate threat had been neutralized, Casey and Marcus were taken to Chief Harlan's office, where a team of officers guarded the doors. Harlan paced, visibly shaken. "This is bigger than we thought, Casey," he said, rubbing his temples. "They're attacking our own station. They're desperate." Casey nodded, feeling the weight of the situation sink in even deeper. "They know Marcus has seen something that could ruin them. But we can't just hide him here anymore. It's not safe." Harlan agreed, his gaze shifting to Marcus, who was huddled on the couch, exhausted. "We need a plan, a place where they can't reach him." As they discussed options, an idea struck Casey. "What if we take him to a safe house, somewhere off the radar, no ties to the department? We'll keep the location secret, even from our own officers." Harlan considered her suggestion, nodding slowly. "That might work. We'll arrange transportation and set up a rotation of officers we can trust." Casey glanced over at Marcus, who was half asleep, his head resting on the couch. She couldn't help but feel protective of him. "I'll go with him, Chief. I'll stay by his side until this is over." By nightfall, they had made arrangements to transfer Marcus to a secluded cabin outside of town. Only Chief Harlan, Casey, and a handful of trusted officers knew the location. They would rotate shifts, ensuring that Marcus was never left unguarded. As they prepared to leave, Casey took Marcus aside, giving him a reassuring smile. "You're going to be okay, Marcus. We're taking you somewhere safe." Marcus looked up at her with tired eyes. Will I ever get to go home again? Casey's heart ached at his words. Yes, Marcus, you will. But right now, we have to make sure you're safe. And that means staying hidden for a little while longer. He nodded, though the sadness in his eyes didn't fade. She knew this was hard for him, being so young and torn away from his family. But she also knew it was the only way to keep him alive. The drive was tense, with Casey and Harlan constantly checking their surroundings. They took a series of detours, weaving through back roads to avoid detection. Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, watching the darkened landscape pass by. About halfway to the cabin, Casey's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She opened it, her stomach sinking as she read the words. We know where you're going. You can't hide him forever. Her eyes darted to Chief Harlan, showing him the message. His jaw clenched, and he immediately radioed the officers following them, warning them to stay alert. We have a leak, he muttered. Someone in our own ranks is feeding them information. Casey's heart pounded as she realized the danger was even closer than she'd thought. They couldn't trust anyone, not even some of their own officers. As they neared the final turnoff, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, speeding toward them. Casey's instincts kicked in. They'd found us. Chief, we need to lose them. Harlan nodded, his hands steady on the wheel as he picked up speed, weaving through the narrow, winding road. The vehicle behind them accelerated as well, closing in. Marcus, stay down, Casey ordered, pushing him down against the seat. She reached for her gun, preparing for the worst. The car behind them swerved, trying to force them off the road. Casey and Harlan exchanged a look, both understanding the gravity of the situation. We can't let them catch us, Casey, Harlan said, his voice grim. Casey nodded, tightening her grip on her weapon. She leaned out of the window, firing a warning shot at the pursuing vehicle. The car swerved, but the driver held steady, undeterred. They were nearly at the turnoff when another car appeared ahead, blocking their path. They were trapped, boxed in on both sides. This is it, Casey whispered, her heart pounding as the cars surrounded them. The men from the vehicle stepped out, guns drawn, and began approaching their car. One of them shouted, "Hand over the boy," and nobody gets hurt. But Casey knew better. They wouldn't let any of them live. She glanced at Harlan, who gave a small nod. We fight. The men advanced, their intentions clear. Casey and Harlan exchanged one last look, ready to protect Marcus with everything they had. And then, just as the attackers closed in, sirens sounded in the distance. Backup had arrived. But would they make it in time? The sirens blared louder, and the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the road as backup finally arrived. The attackers hesitated, glancing at each other with uncertainty. But the look in their eyes told Casey they weren't about to give up without a fight. Stay down, Marcus, she urged, pressing him further into the back seat. Chief Harlan fired a warning shot, which echoed through the night. Step back. He shouted at the men, his voice firm. You're surrounded. There's nowhere to run. But the men didn't move. Instead, one of them, a leader, by the looks of it, smirked and raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Casey. You think you can protect him, he sneered. This is bigger than all of you. Hand him over, and maybe you'll walk away. Casey clenched her jaw, refusing to be intimidated. You'll have to go through us first. For a moment, it was a standoff. Casey's heart pounded as she held her gun steady, her eyes trained on the men in front of them. But then, a swarm of officers emerged from the backup vehicles, guns drawn and voices raised, shouting commands. The men quickly realized they were outnumbered. One of them lowered his weapon, backing away. But the leader stood his ground, glaring at Casey and Harlan with a cold, hateful stare. You've just made the biggest mistake of your lives, he hissed before finally dropping his weapon. The officers rushed in, handcuffing him and the others. But Casey knew this wasn't over. If anything, the stakes had just been raised. After the harrowing encounter, Casey, Chief Harlan, and Marcus finally reached the secluded cabin in the woods. The area was quiet, isolated from the city, and surrounded by towering trees that hid it from view. The safe house was simple, a small single-storied cabin with reinforced windows and a heavy duty lock on the door. A handful of trusted officers would be stationed nearby, rotating shifts to keep a constant watch. Inside, Casey led Marcus to a small room with a bed and a few blankets. She knelt beside him, giving him a reassuring smile. We'll be safe here, Marcus. You can rest, she said gently. He looked at her, his eyes wary. Will they come back for me? Casey hesitated, then nodded. They might, but we'll be ready for them. I promise I won't let anyone hurt you. Marcus nodded, his small shoulders slumping with exhaustion. She stayed by his side until he finally drifted off to sleep, his breathing slow and steady. Once he was asleep, Casey rejoined Harlan in the main room, where they reviewed the day's events. "We've had a serious problem," Harlan said, his voice low. "These people have resources, connections, and no scruples about using violence. They'll stop at nothing." Casey nodded. "They know exactly where to find us, and someone on the inside is feeding them information." "Agreed," Harlan said, sighing heavily. "We'll have to keep our plans tight. No more shared locations unless absolutely necessary. And we have to be careful with who we trust." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Finally, Harlan broke the silence. "We need to get that footage out," he said. "That's our best leverage right now. If the public sees what happened to Marcus, it'll be harder for them to cover this up." Casey nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I'll reach out to Reynolds again. Maybe we can find a way to release it anonymously if his office is still compromised." Early the next morning, while Casey was checking the perimeter, she received a message on her secure phone. It was from Reynolds. "Meet me at Pier 21 tonight. I have a way to get the footage out without them tracking us. Come alone?" Casey's instincts prickled with suspicion. Meeting him alone was risky, especially considering how tight their surveillance had become. But she also knew that if they didn't release the footage soon, the entire investigation could be in jeopardy. She shared the message with Harlan, who frowned, deep in thought. "It sounds risky, but Reynolds is the only one who can get this footage out fast. And if he's being monitored, he wouldn't risk this unless he had a real plan." After a moment's hesitation, Casey agreed. "I'll go, but I'll take precautions. We can't afford any mistakes." That night, Casey arrived at Pier 21, shrouded in darkness and empty save for the occasional sounds of waves against the dock. She kept her hand close to her weapon, every sense on high alert. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Reynolds, clutching a small flash drive. He glanced around nervously before handing it to her. "This is it," he whispered. "Everything's on here. The footage, the reports, the evidence we've collected. Once you release this, there's no going back." Casey nodded, taking the drive. "Do you have a way to broadcast it?" Reynolds nodded, pulling out a small device. "This can override local news channels for a brief window. We can stream it live tonight, but it'll only last a few minutes before they cut us off." They quickly discussed the plan, their voices low. But just as they were finalizing the details, the sound of footsteps echoed across the dock. Casey and Reynolds froze, their eyes darting to the shadows. 3 men emerged, guns raised, their faces hidden by masks. One of them spoke, his voice cold and menacing. "You really thought you could outsmart us?" He sneered, his gaze fixed on Casey. Casey's heart pounded as she and Reynolds backed up, trying to find an escape route, but they were trapped. The man took a step closer, his gun aimed directly at her. "Hand over the drive, detective, and we'll let you walk away." Casey's grip tightened around the drive, every muscle in her body tensed. She knew that if they took the evidence, Marcus's story might never see the light of day. But then she noticed a glimmer of light reflected off a security camera overhead. An idea struck her. Keeping her voice steady, she spoke just loud enough for the camera's microphone to catch. "If you want this evidence, you'll have to kill us both." The man smirked. "That can be arranged." Just as he raised his gun, Casey hit the emergency alert on her phone, triggering a high-pitched alarm. The sudden sound startled the men, giving her a split-second window to act. She grabbed Reynolds and dove behind a stack of crates, shielding him as bullets flew. Casey fired back, hitting one of the men in the leg. He cried out, collapsing to the ground as his partners returned fire. But the commotion had attracted attention. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance as a swarm of police vehicles approached, sirens blaring. The men hesitated, realizing they were about to be outnumbered. One of them grabbed their wounded partner, and they retreated into the darkness, disappearing just as backup arrived. Hours later, Casey and Reynolds returned to the safe house, exhausted but victorious. They had managed to get the footage into the hands of a trusted reporter, and plans were in place for a nationwide broadcast. But as they entered the cabin, a chilling sight greeted them. Marcus's room was empty. The bed was neatly made, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Casey's heart stopped as she scanned the room, dread pooling in her stomach. A single note lay on the pillow, scrawled in messy handwriting. "You can run, but you can't hide. The boy is ours." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Marcus had been taken. They'd been so focused on the footage, so determined to expose the truth, that they hadn't anticipated the enemies slipping past their defenses. The safe house was compromised. Casey's fists clenched as a surge of anger and fear swept over her. They had come this far, risked everything, and now Marcus was in the hands of the very people who wanted to silence him. But this wasn't over. She wouldn't stop until she brought him back. With a determined glint in her eye, she turned to Chief Harlan. They took him. We're going after them. Whatever it takes, we're getting him back. The air in the safe house crackled with tension as Casey and Chief Harlan stood over the note, their minds racing. The world outside felt surreal, almost quiet, as the reality of Marcus's abduction sank in. They had to move fast. Every second counted. We need to figure out who took him, Harlan said, his voice grave. They left a note, so they must think they're in control. We can't give them that satisfaction. Casey nodded, her heart pounding. I'll reach out to the team. We need to gather everything we have on the suspects, anyone who might have been watching us or knew where we were. Good idea, Harlan replied, and I'll get a team together to search the area. We need to canvass the neighborhood, talk to anyone who might have seen something. They can't be far. As Harlan left to organize the search, Casey grabbed her phone and contacted the few officers she could trust. She needed their expertise and support to get Marcus back. Time was running out, and they had to act quickly. Casey spent the next few hours poring over evidence, reports, and security footage from the safe house and surrounding areas. She combed through every detail, looking for anything that could lead them to Marcus. As she reviewed the footage, she noticed something odd. Just before Marcus had gone missing, a black SUV had parked near the cabin. The driver's face was obscured, but Casey could see a glimpse of a tattoo on the man's arm as he exited the vehicle. It was a symbol she recognized from her previous investigations, one associated with a local gang known for their violent tactics and deep connections in the community. Gotcha, she whispered to herself, determination flooding through her. She quickly shared her findings with Harlan. I think I found our lead, Casey said, pointing to the footage. This SUV belongs to a gang that's been operating in the area. If they're involved, they might know where Marcus is. Harlan nodded, his expression serious. Let's track down that vehicle. We need to find out where they hang out and if they have Marcus. Later that evening, after gathering a team, Casey and Harlan set out to track down the gang. They knew it was dangerous, but they had no choice. They needed to find Marcus before it was too late. Following leads through back alleys and run-down neighborhoods, they eventually arrived at an old warehouse that had been identified as a meeting spot for the gang. The building was dark and ominous, with broken windows and graffiti covering the walls. Stay close, Harlan instructed the team, his voice a low whisper. They moved cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of movement. As they crept closer to the warehouse, Casey's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. They were on the brink of a confrontation that could change everything. Suddenly, a noise caught her attention, a low muffled sound coming from inside. She motioned to Harlan, who nodded, and they moved closer to investigate. Peeking through a crack in the door, Casey could see several men gather around a table, discussing something in hushed tones. In the center of the table was a familiar backpack, Marcus's. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no doubt about it. Marcus was here, and they had to get him out. Okay, here's the plan, Harlan whispered, outlining their approach. We'll split into two teams. One will create a distraction while the other goes in to grab Marcus. We'll need to act fast before they realize what's happening. Casey nodded, adrenaline coursing through her veins. I'll go in with the second team. We can't leave him in there any longer than necessary. They carefully organized their positions, then Harlan took a deep breath. On my mark. 3, 2, 1, now. At Harlan's signal, the first team threw a flashbang into the warehouse, creating a loud explosion of light and sound. The gang members scrambled, caught off guard, and Casey seized the opportunity. She led her team inside, guns drawn, scanning for any sign of Marcus. The room was chaotic, with the gang members shouting and stumbling over each other. Where is he? Casey yelled, her voice cutting through the noise. Back there, one of the gang members shouted, pointing toward a door at the back of the warehouse. Without wasting a second, Casey rushed forward, pushing through the chaos as her team followed closely behind. They reached the door and flung it open, revealing a dark, musty room. And there, tied to a chair, was Marcus, his eyes wide with fear but relieved to see her. Marcus, Casey cried, rushing to him. She quickly untied him, her heart racing. Are you okay? I'm scared, he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. I know, buddy, "But you're safe now," she assured him, pulling him into a tight hug. Just as they began to leave, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse. The gang members had regrouped, and they were angry. Casey's heart sank as she realized they were surrounded. "Get back!" Harlan shouted, but it was too late. The gang members emerged from the shadows, guns drawn, ready to retaliate. Casey grabbed Marcus, shielding him with her body as the tension in the room skyrocketed. The gang leader stepped forward, his eyes filled with fury. "You think you can just take him?" he spat, raising his weapon. "This isn't over." Suddenly, a shot rang out and chaos erupted. The room exploded into gunfire as Casey fought to protect Marcus, her instincts kicking in. She aimed her weapon, firing back as her team rallied around her. But then, just as quickly as it began, the sound of sirens filled the air, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Backup had arrived, and the gang knew they were outmatched. "Get down!" Harlan yelled, and they all ducked for cover as officers stormed in, guns raised. The gang members started to retreat, but Casey couldn't let them get away. She spotted the leader trying to escape through a back door. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice firm. "You're not getting away." With her heart pounding, she chased after him, determined to bring him to justice. They raced through the warehouse, dodging debris and chaos. The gang leader was fast, but Casey was fueled by the need to protect Marcus and bring him back safely. As they reached the exit, he turned, his face twisted in anger. "You'll regret this," he yelled, raising his gun once more. Casey's instincts kicked in, and she fired, hitting his shoulder. He stumbled back, pain etched across his face as he dropped his weapon. "Put your hands up," she shouted, keeping her gun trained on him. "You're under arrest." As officers flooded into the warehouse, the gang leader sneered. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but we'll come back for you. You'll see." Casey felt a chill run down her spine, but she held her ground. "You can try, but we'll be ready." With the gang members apprehended and Marcus safe, Casey allowed herself a moment to breathe. They had made it through this nightmare, but the battle was far from over. Later that night, back at the safe house, Casey sat with Marcus in the living room, relief washing over her as she hugged him tightly. "You're safe now," she whispered, wiping away his tears. "I was so scared," he said, his voice shaking. "I know, but you're so brave," Casey replied, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "We'll make sure you're always safe from now on." As they settled in, Casey couldn't shake the feeling that the gang's threat lingered in the air. She knew they had to stay vigilant. The truth about Marcus's abduction needed to come to light, and they were just beginning to uncover the depths of the conspiracy surrounding it. Little did they know, the struggle was far from over, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges that tested their resolve. But one thing was certain, Casey was ready to fight for justice, no matter what it took. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into Marcus's abduction unraveled a complex web of corruption and crime that had plagued the community for far too long. Casey and her team worked tirelessly, digging deep into the gang's operations and connections, revealing a network that reached far beyond what they had initially imagined. The first breakthrough came when they discovered that the gang leader had ties to several local officials, including some who had been complicit in their activities. With this information in hand, Casey knew they had to act quickly. The community needed to see that justice was being served, and the gang needed to be dismantled before they could strike again. With the help of their department and local authorities, Casey and Harlan coordinated a series of raids on the gang's known hideouts. They worked closely with federal agents, sharing intelligence and planning their moves. Each raid yielded evidence, drugs, weapons, and documents linking the gang to corrupt officials. The pressure was mounting, and it wasn't long before the media caught wind of the story. News reports detailed the gang's activities, the ongoing investigation, and Marcus's abduction, igniting public outrage. Community members began to speak up, sharing their experiences and demanding accountability. One particularly harrowing story came from a local woman whose son had been threatened by the gang. With the community rallying behind them, Casey and Harlan felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew they were not just fighting for Marcus, but for every child in the neighborhood. Eventually, the evidence amassed was enough to make arrests. One by one, the gang members were taken into custody, facing charges ranging from drug trafficking to assault. The gang leader, having survived the shootout, was apprehended during one of the raids. His face twisted with anger and disbelief as he was led away in handcuffs. "Your days of terrorizing this community are over," Casey said as she watched him being escorted out. The gang leader glared at her, but she held her ground, unflinching. As the arrest continued, Casey and her team uncovered the truth about the corrupt officials involved. Several high-ranking members of the local government were implicated, leading to an investigation that sent shockwaves through the community. They were arrested, their corruption exposed, and the truth finally revealed. With the gang dismantled and the corrupt officials arrested, the community began to heal. A rally was organized, where Casey and Harlan were honored for their bravery and dedication. Local residents came together, celebrating the new sense of safety that had returned to their neighborhood. Marcus stood proudly beside Casey during the event, his smile shining brightly. "I'm not scared anymore," he declared, his voice ringing with hope. "Thank you for bringing me back and making everything better." Casey felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had fought for this moment, for Marcus, and for every child in the community. The support of the people fueled her drive to continue the fight against injustice, ensuring that no one else would have to experience what Marcus had gone through. As the dust settled, Casey found herself reflecting on everything that had transpired. She had always been passionate about her job, but this case had reignited her purpose. She decided to start an outreach program in the community, focusing on youth mentorship and providing resources to prevent future crime. The program aimed to educate children about their rights, instill confidence, and empower them to stand against injustice. Casey believed that by investing in the community, they could create a safer environment for everyone. Harlan, impressed by Casey's vision, offered his support. "Let's make this happen together," he said. They worked hand in hand, gathering volunteers and organizing workshops, determined to make a lasting difference. Months later, as Casey looked around at the first youth workshop, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The room was filled with children, eager to learn and share their stories. She smiled as Marcus, now a confident young boy, took the stage to speak about his experience and the importance of standing together against fear. "Together we are strong," he said, his voice steady. "We won't let anyone take away our safety again. We will fight for what is right." The applause that followed echoed through the room, a powerful reminder of how far they had come. The community had transformed, and while the scars of the past would take time to heal, they were determined to forge a brighter future together. As the program continued to grow, Casey felt hopeful. She had made a promise to protect the community and to ensure that no child would ever have to face what Marcus had endured. The fight for justice was ongoing, but together they had shown that change was possible. With the gang behind bars and a supportive community standing strong, Casey knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the end, justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about healing, understanding, and moving forward. And that was the legacy they would build together, one step at a time. As the sun set over the neighborhood, casting a warm glow on the faces of those who had come together in solidarity, Casey felt a sense of peace. They were not just survivors, they were warriors ready to stand up against injustice and create a better tomorrow for everyone.